This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. This is your host, Rob Port, with you, as always, wrapping up the week on Friday. In a moment, going to talk with Senator Kevin Cramer, and we got all sorts of stuff to talk about. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about how you're listening to this podcast. You should be subscribed through a podcasting app. No, I talk about that all the time. Listen however the heck you want. But subscribing through a podcast app works better for me, because then you'll be alerted every time I have a new episode, and you'll be more likely to listen, which is the whole point of all of this, is you listening. So do that if you would. Also, if whatever platform you're listening on allows you to do a rating or review of the podcast, if you'd leave an honest one, I would appreciate that. And of course, here's my pitch to subscribe, because I spend actually most of my time writing, and to read the stuff that I write, you have to be a subscriber. And you should subscribe, because if you live in North Dakota or Minnesota, we have publications across the region. I would argue that we're probably the most comprehensive news source in the state. It doesn't matter which of our publications you subscribe to, the Fargo Forum, the Grand Forks Herald, the Dickinson Press. Subscribe to one, you get them all. It's one low monthly price, $10 a month. It's a heck of a deal. Check it out. Best place to go, inforum.com/subscribe. That's an easy one, but really, if you subscribe on any of them, it works across the platform. So I appreciate that. And Senator Cramer, first of all, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks, Robin. By the way, I loved listening to that. I think in all times we've done this, I've never heard the menu of ways. And as you were talking about all the ways that we can listen to or read you, I'm thinking, I wonder which ones I am, because I know I get your alerts. Of course, I go all the way back, of course, to the to
Say Anything blog.
When you were doing Say Anything blog before, when you were doing this before it was cool. And I'm still not sure it's cool. But I'm still doing it. And you're still doing it, and it's pretty cool. And you were a trailblazer. I mean, I know you probably don't want to toot your own horn. You were, because I remember, Rob, you getting a lot of awards early in the process too, some pretty prestigious national ones. But then the other thing is, of course, being on Inforum and all that, and of course your merging and partnership and all of that is created. Well, let's just put it this way: your innovations have led to multimedia opportunities for legacy newsrooms that I hope they appreciate. Shall we say?
Well, I appreciate that. It's been a lot of fun. It's great working for the Forum. Except when I'm accused of being a traitor and selling out and going to work for them. Although I always laugh at that stuff. I don't hear much from them. I file my stories, I do my thing, and as far as them telling me what to write, like everybody wants to believe that, right? Like somebody they disagree with out there. There must be somebody behind them working the puppet strings, or it could just be this person disagrees with you. I don't know. We lost Wayne Stenjum.
Yeah,
that was tough. It's such a somber week.
Rob, it's so interesting because I'm a person that believes that our time on Earth is a snap of a finger, but there's an eternity, and I'm quite faithful about that, as you probably know.
Oh, yeah.
I believe in God's promises, and yet death is still one of the things that. Well, again, I'm secure in the future. It's still a tough one. And when something like this happens to somebody like Wayne in this moment of his career and all of our relationships, it's a particularly tough one. And when you just think of, first of all, just think of the hundreds, thousands of lives that he personally touched. And by that, I mean literally personally touched, because he was such a people person. He loved campaigning, I think, about as much or more than anybody I've ever known. He used to go on the end of the campaign bus tour, even when he wasn't on the ballot that election cycle. He liked it that much.
It's easy to like campaigning too when you never really faced any serious competition.
There is that, but he did earn his way by being very well known, popular.
Well,
sitting. office holder.
There's an argument to be made for why he wasn't facing a lot of competition. I mean, that's kind of like, right? Well, job well done. Right. I mean, if somebody thought he was doing terrible and could get traction, they could have jumped in and done something about it. But
no question.
I think that was a ringing endorsement. He was doing a good job. So it was
absolutely
tough.
No question. Well said.
And to lose him, I mean, not that long. I mean, I interviewed him shortly after he made his announcement that he wasn't going to run again. But when he was still considering it, nobody thought like, oh, he's too old, or he's not in good health, or he's not vital anymore. I mean, everyone thought, yeah, if he wants another 4 years, he could certainly get those 4 years and do the same job he's been doing all along. And then all of a sudden, he's just not here. And I guess a reminder that life is a I'm forgetting the word. It's a fragile thing. That's the word.
It's a fragile thing. There's no question. And it's a gift by minutes, minute by minute gift, hour by hour, day by day gift. And we ought to look at it that way and celebrate it that way. And Wayne, I was at the funeral yesterday, and a lot of people were, a couple thousand people were, and a lot of people watched it, I'm sure, online and other ways. But that's what we are reminded at moments like this, of how fragile it is. It makes you go back and talk to your loved ones a little bit differently in the meantime. Anyway, it was a tough one. It was a gut punch, and it sucks. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It really does stink. But it's interesting, Rob, because I've worked really closely with Wayne these last 9 years, and particularly the last 3 in the Senate on big things for North Dakota that were good for the country. And, the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States took up this SCOTUS, this WOTUS, Waters of the U.S. decision, is due in no small part to the legal work that Wayne did on the prevailing, when he prevailed in the district court on behalf of North Dakota and a whole bunch of other states. On the WOTUS rule from the Obama era, and without going through all the steps that find us where we are, that was the sort of the main legal victory for states' rights, and it became sort of the hallmark, if you will, case for WOTUS, and at least in the modern era, in the Trump post Obama era. So really, here we are, preparing for a Supreme Court, ruling, or Supreme Court hearing and ruling on a definition of navigable waters that, again, Justice Scalia hopefully wrote the defining one that will prevail way back when, and now our own Attorney General. So that, and there are a whole bunch of other things. The other big one that we've been working on quite closely with him, and when I say working on, remembering I'm a legislator, he obviously is a litigator, but is the reimbursement that we believe the federal government owes North Dakota for DAPL protest security costs. And the Obama administration, of course, in my view, was culpable. I mean, in facilitating illegal activity. The Trump White House and Department of Justice both denied North Dakota's efforts to be reimbursed by the federal government. They said, no, that's a state's issue, policing the state's issue. And right at the highest levels in the White House argued with me on this point. Yeah. And but through my seat on the Armed Services Committee and the Environment and Public Works Committee, I was able to get some people on the record, in hearings that eventually became, set some table and were deposed. So Wayne and I worked very closely together on a lot of that stuff to prepare for what I think is going to end up being a successful challenge through the Federal Tort Claims Act. Just, again, these are sort of wonky things, but really big things for North Dakota and for states' rights. Consequential for sure, and precedent setting. So anyway, his mark is great, and we're going to miss him a lot.
I was talking to somebody who was at the funeral, and I didn't go, and I never feel like my presence, because I occupy a role. I mean, I got to write critical things about you guys sometimes. So showing up in a personal way sometimes is weird for me. Like I don't know. So I didn't go.
Well, not everybody appreciates, frankly, the jobs that you and I have to do that aren't the same job.
Yeah.
Right. And I just so you know, while I'm still alive, that's not how I view it at all. So I first of all think of you as a servant.
I spoke to a lot of people who were just it was how remarkable the outpouring was, and not taking away anything from who Wayne Stenjum was, because I think he earned it. But I wonder how much of it was driven by a thirst for the sort of leadership that maybe Americans, North Dakotans, don't feel like we have a lot of anymore. I mean, he was that sort of a leader, where I think he was honorable, he was dignified. Even when you were disagreeing with him, it was hard to be disagreeable with him. And I wonder if there's a feeling that we've lost that, and we lost sort of an avatar for that in Wayne. I don't know. That was just my personal musing.
It's a pretty profound thought, but Wayne fits that bill, to your point. Exactly. Fits that bill. He was never disagreeable, even when he disagreed. I think in one of the interviews I did say that if Wayne was really stern with you, it was probably for a really good reason, and it was also very rare. Because even when he disagreed, he was never disagreeable. In fact, he was, if anything, he was joyful. I mean, he was a cheerful, joyful guy.
He was.
And and smart. And he was also patient, Rob. And I think in today's political world, we're not very patient. I just finished my talk radio town hall, and people call me, and they're really, really mad about what's going on in Georgia with the elections, and why aren't Republicans doing more? And I'm thinking, I said to this person, how much more do you want us to do? We have killed this ridiculous federal overtake. And by the way, the question was centered around revelations of ballot harvesting. And I've said, well, ballot harvesting is one of the things that the Democrats want to put in federal law as a mandate for states. Georgia passed legislation. Guess that we killed that legislation about 5 or 6 times now in the United States Senate with every Republican vote. That's a really good result. Really, really good result. But the caller, I could tell, his issue wasn't the result. His issue was, you aren't screaming loudly enough about it. And that's sort of not, well, first of all, it's not what I do. And second of all, it's not very productive. And thirdly, to your point, it's sort of more and more what people expect. And people like Wayne Stenhjem never fell for that. He was always patient.
The public has an appetite for reactionaries right now.
Yeah,
and
it does.
Speaking of which, let's shift to the thing I wanted to talk to you about.
Sure.
Because you're a Republican, obviously a member of Congress, but also a former state party leader. In Utah, the Republican National Committee is having their winter meetings, which makes me laugh. It sounds like baseball's. It sounds like baseball's winter meetings, which I'm missing right now because the baseball people are fighting and we're having a lockout.
Yes.
Anyway, they want to censure Representative Liz Cheney and Representative Adam Kinzinger for their participation. In fact, I'm going to read some excerpts from the resolution. Now, this passed unanimously, I guess, in the Resolutions Committee, and is now going to be voted on by the full Republican National Committee. And this is what it says. I quote, "The Republican National Committee hereby formally censures Representatives Liz Cheney of Wyoming and Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, and shall immediately cease any and all support of them as members of the Republican Party for their behavior, which has been destructive to the institution of the U.S. House of Representatives, the Republican Party, and our republic, and is inconsistent with the position of the conference." It goes on and accuses them of sabotaging Republicans and everything else. What do you make of this situation as a Republican? Is this a good use of our time?
Well, when I go back to your point of when I was a Republican Party chairman, and there's a lot of evidence of this, including Fargo Forum editorials, where I quote, tried to pried the doors of our party open, because of course we've been in the political wilderness for about 35 years in North Dakota when I became the state party chairman. And I was brazen enough to appoint co-chairs of the Republican Platform Committee, Resolutions Committee, that included one pro-life and one pro-choice chair, even though I'm very, very pro-life, and we were a very pro-life party, and I took a lot of criticism for that. My point being that, in my view, in politics, you just don't have the luxury of kicking people out of your party. Now, that doesn't mean we embrace them, but everything they stand for. But the House of Representatives is a very special institution in our republic. And what's special about it is it's the most local of the federal, offices, obviously, because every member has roughly the same population they represent. That's why they're called the, quote, People's House. It's why they have two-year terms. I always like to say, you're never more than about 600 days away from your next performance evaluation in the House of Representatives, and in fact, fewer. And so the House is very special. And what's special about it, again, is that the local 700,000 roughly people that each representative represents are the boss. They decide your credentials, and many fewer than that when you consider that your first job in re-election is the primary process. So I just don't feel I think it's sort of unnecessary. It's really unnecessary and unproductive for the National Party to be trying to dictate the credentials and the behavior of a House member. In fact, the Republican National Committee largely exists not for House members or for senators, but for the presidency. And so I don't like it, Rob. But I also am very displeased with Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney for what they are doing. I basically agree with the resolution. What I don't agree with is that the resolution is being offered up and trying to be passed by the RNC.
Why do you agree with the resolution? I mean, what's so bad about serving on this January 6th committee?
Because here's my biggest problem with it. And my biggest problem is that Nancy Pelosi rejected the Republican members of the January 6th commission.
Including Congressman Armstrong. I mean, our own Kelly Armstrong.
Precisely right. Because they were, quote, too pro-Trump. Speaking of a violation of the House of Representatives, that institution and its principles, that is a gross violation of it, conducted not by one member, but by the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
And I've spoken with Kelly about this, and I think he makes a fantastic point that we are setting a very terrible precedent where the majority party in this current Congress has begun dictating to the minority party who committee members are going to be. Like the minority party doesn't even have the ability and realizing the Democrats, I guess, would argue that, well, these are two, because it's not just the January 6th committee. There's another, and the example is eluding me now, but they would say, well, this is an extraordinary situation, but that's always how it starts, right? It's always extraordinary until it becomes, I guess, ordinary. But I mean, that's a fair point, but nothing, you don't think any, and I guess I've read your quotes, and you don't think the review of January 6th or anything at this point is even worthwhile.
There's been a review of January 6th by a Senate committee, and I don't remember if there's a joint committee, by a Senate committee, bipartisan. The Rules Committee. There are a whole bunch of reviews going on by the Department of Justice, and the House Committee doesn't even have access to all of that information yet, because there are hundreds of reviews, because they're individual prosecutions or investigations. And so when the January 6th Commission was created, it wasn't created for a review. It was created for the gathering of evidence to implicate Donald Trump, not to get to justice. And this is what's so concerning to me about Adam and Liz's involvement in it. It validates a witch hunt, not a true seeking of justice. And so I would have supported a bipartisan commission that was truly focused on finding answers, as opposed to one that was designed to be a political weapon. And it's proven to be exactly that. I think that
seems like a unicorn when it comes to these congressional inquiries. I mean, or any of them. Yeah. I don't know, but I mean, the thing is Democrats control the House. I mean, I think there is valid information that's been coming out from their inquiries. I mean, I feel like we know more about what happened.
One thing we do know from their inquiries is that Donald Trump didn't have anything to do with it. At this point, they found no evidence that Donald Trump was in the war room or wherever it might be, the Situation Room, engineering all of this. His behavior, while you might have concerns about his behavior or his lack of bringing people in, all that, right? But the idea that somehow he masterminded it and that it was this great threat to democracy, I think is completely disproven by the fact that all of the things that people said would happen didn't happen. That we finished our work within, way too late, but still within the same meeting of the two chambers, and certified the election. So it was an ugly day. There's no question about it. I don't sugarcoat it, as you know, and much to the chagrin of some of my conservative friends.
I think we're lucky that we had the forbearance of people like Vice President Pence.
Right. I agree.
And frankly, according to recent revelations, where people were urging President Trump to have the military seize, voting machines, and you had Attorney General Bill Barr, you had even Rudy Giuliani, surprisingly, apparently, reportedly, telling him, no, don't do that. And that was a line the president decided not to cross. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I'm comfortable just saying, well, he walked right up to the line, but he didn't cross it. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. And we're struggling, because one thing that really worries me, getting back to this resolution in the RNC, is that we're getting to a place, and you and I had this conversation before, we're getting to the place where being a Republican is about loyalty to Donald Trump and not loyalty to Republican ideas or conservative ideas for the country. Because that's what this resolution, I mean, that bothers me more. You don't like Liz Cheney, fine. A lot of people didn't like her dad either, fine. Right. That is what it is. That's politics. Yep. What I don't like is that this is the party saying you have to be loyal to this man. And I find that repugnant, frankly.
You know, this is why I think one of the things I said earlier about the RNC is largely about presidential elections and then presidents. So if you elect a president, just to back up a little experience, when George Herbert Walker Bush lost re-election, I was on the RNC. I was the state party chairman. And I'll never forget, and Mitch McConnell and I talk about this from time to time, and Bob Dole was involved in it. You know, they wanted to have, not Mitch, but Senator Dole wanted to have a United States senator be the RNC chairman. And I'll never forget, Bob Dole talked to me many times about this. He said, you know, I'd like a senator, and the senator he wanted was a young Mitch McConnell. He thought he'd be a great national committeeman or national committee chairman. And I remember saying to him, and this was actually before the election, and I said, but if we lose the election, the members are going to want a member to be the chairman of the party. In other words, and we did lose the election, and a member did become the chairman, and it was Haley Barbour. I gave his first seconding speech in Missouri at the time. In other words, but if you win the presidency, the president picks the chairman of the Republican National Committee. So that's always been the tradition, and for good reason. Now remember, the National Republican Congressional Committee exists for House, National Republican Senate Committee exists to support Republicans in the Senate. But the RNC is largely a White House-driven organization, and now it's spilling over. But it is driven, without a question, by the immense, and when I say immense, I mean immense popularity of Donald Trump, the person, the former president, within the grassroots of the party. So just like whereas Congress, House members represent the grassroots of their district, the RNC represents the grassroots of the Republicans in a particular state in each of their states.
What do you think of this? Because it's not just, I mean, this is now playing out at the RNC, but it's Liz Cheney's state party censured her. We've seen censures of other, and right here in North Dakota, where we've seen state lawmakers censured by their local districts. Just this last week, we saw one of the districts that was reorganizing because of redistricting, tried to pass a resolution censuring State Representative Todd Porter from Mandan, and try to call on NDGOP Party Chair Perry Schaefer to step down. So it's the tactic is everywhere, and I guess that gets back to the original question I asked you: is this a good use of our time? Because I feel like your comment about we don't have the luxury of kicking people out of the party. You put it to me in a different way another time. You don't win with subtraction.
Right.
So
yeah. I remember when I needed every single possible voting Republican or anybody who would consider being Republican to vote to win elections. But we are in North Dakota, in my view, suffering a little bit from our own success because we have no one else to fight with. And so when you have a tent so large and so diverse with so much diversity under it, you do end up, encircling firing squads from time to time. And that's, I think, what we're experiencing now. A lot of it is driven, though, by philosophy. And there is a legitimate concern that people with a more libertarian bent in our party are not treated equally or treated with even the respect they deserve by several in the party. Now, that has sort of shifted somewhat when they've gained a little bit of a foothold. They've had some successes at the district level, successes I support. And I remember supporting the libertarian-leaning Republicans at the convention to a point where, let's just say we had some screaming matches. And now they've had to go other routes, and they've gotten a foothold through the normal means. And so it's become more contentious and more combative. By the way, I want to say right up front, I should have said right up front, Perry Schaefer has been the man in the middle, and I quite honestly can't imagine anybody doing a better job of refereeing this than he has done, which is probably why people on all sides are mad at him. But I'm one that has watched with great admiration how he's refereed this. I mean, being pressured on the one hand to take a slate of people that he would appoint as district chairman in districts that were redrawn. He resisted that, and then when the other factions couldn't quite get their person elected, somehow it's Perry Schaefer's fault. All of that say that's the price of leadership. I just think we're suffering a little bit from our own success, and we need a referee that can bring all the sides together and say, hey, are we going to be center right, or are we going to be a fractured party? And the result of a fractured party is the Democrats win elections.
Let's should we shift, talk about China?
Sure, why not?
Because there's an issue. The
common enemies.
The Olympics are common enemy. I don't think we're enemies. I mean, talking about the libertarian wing, I mean, that's my wing of the party. I've been very critical of them, although I don't like this. I don't know that libertarian's the right word anymore. I mean,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
This shift towards populism drives me up the wall. I am the anti-populist, I guess. But let's talk about China, because there's an international issue and then a local issue where that I think are the same. I mean, at the international level, the Olympics are beginning today. Opening ceremonies and all. And maybe they've already had with the time zone. Maybe it's already happened in China.
It's hard to know. Yeah,
I think it has actually.
I think it has.
I won't be watching it. Or I don't even know if I'm going to watch it, because this kind of feels like the Munich Olympics again, right? I don't. Yes. I understand what's going on in China. I don't agree with these people who try to suggest that America doesn't have the moral high ground when it comes to China. For all our failings, we're not that. Right. So I'm watching what's going on. So that's playing out. I think a lot of Americans are struggling because we love the Olympics, and why not? They're fun, and we have a lot of wonderful, talented people who go and compete. And so we want to watch, we want to support our athletes, but on the other hand, we don't want to support China. So I think we're having that conflict. And that's playing out at the local level in Grand Forks, where there is a corn milling facility that's coming in. The parent company is based in China. Now, they argue they're publicly traded. They're not owned by the Chinese Communist Party. But the thing is, it seems to me like every company in China is not owned by the Chinese Communist Party until they are, until the communists want to start pulling some strings. That's the Fufeng group. So now you have a debate that's going on right here in Grand Forks, where a corn milling facility would be wonderful for that area, right? I mean, well, aside from the usual arguments about I don't want to hear the noise, I don't want to smell the smells. I mean, that's the routine stuff, but it's going to create jobs. It's another outlet for our agricultural products, and the local officials are supporting it for the most part. But again, it's this idea where how long are we going to keep business with China? So I think we're all kind of trying to navigate. Our culture and our economy is so thoroughly intertwined with China that it's hard to grapple with the reality of what China is.
Yeah, no, it's really complicated, Rob. I will tell you that the more I know, the more I learn about China, the more we see the evolution of China, that I'm less and less comfortable having anything to do with China. And to your previous point, that if you're not owned by the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, you're going to be. That's just a fact. When China was allowed into the WTO, I was a economic development and finance director in North Dakota, and I remember I hosted the first two, and I think to this point the only two Chinese ambassadors to the United States on trips to North Dakota, and they came here under the guise of interested in trade and whatnot. But what their interest was in getting people like Ed Schaefer and me to support their entrance into the World Trade Organization, or really a favored nation status, which is to say, favored nation was never a great term, to say normalize trade relations with China. Now, they really wanted that. And so our congressional delegation at the time, all Democratic, but our governor being Republican, they were really here to try to convince us to apply some, public pressure, if you will, to this effort. Now, the at the time, those of us that are free marketers and freedom lovers, to your point, we always thought, well, gee, more trade with China, better treatment of China could lead to them and to, more importantly, to their population seeing this freedom, seeing this capitalism, seeing these free markets and wanting to be part of that, and they would adjust their thinking. Well, nothing close to that has happened. In fact, Xi Jinping is probably as much a tyrant, dictator, communist dictator as that they've had in decades. And so that didn't work. And instead, they steal our technology. They infiltrate every institution they can infiltrate, especially higher education.
Well, look at Dickinson State University right here in North Dakota.
Good example.
Where we had a diploma mill scandal that I don't think the public ever really got the full story on that.
No, but even worse than that, and I've met with foreign ministers and defense ministers in other countries, including Australia, which is in the neighborhood, as you know, who are far more vulnerable than we are, even to a direct Chinese attack, and whose economies are more dependent on China than even ours is. And they've taken much more abrupt action than we are taking right now, and that they kicked them out of all of their higher education because they were coming in the back door and not just getting people educated, but while they're here being educated, spying, tapping into technologies, stealing information and technology from us. So China's bad. Okay. Now, all of that, saying all of that, I'm one person that's less and less interested in China and trying to find more ways to wean ourselves off of China. Fufeng. What does that mean? Well, I've taken it up with some people. I just had dinner the other night with Matt Pottinger. People might know if you're interested in U.S.-Chinese relations, or more importantly, China in general. Matt Pottinger, who's at one of the Hoover Institute, is probably one of the top 3 to 5 experts on China in the country. In fact, he was a deputy national security advisor to President Trump for a couple of years. He's been banned from China. He's one of 10 people that's been banned by China. And he sort of agrees. I mean, he thinks the less we can have to do with China, the better. And I'll kind of leave it at that because it gets over my head pretty fast with Matt. But in the meantime, we have to put all the safeguards. If North Dakota is choosing this investment, we need to put all the possible safeguards around it that we can possibly put, especially proximity to our air base. Very important. They have used other installations, private sector installations, to spy on government installations, including military bases. A lot of the drone work we're doing at the University of North Dakota, which a lot of it is affiliated with the Defense Department. So it is. And whether it's affiliated or not, it's technology that's precious. And so, yes, all of those are concerns that I have about it. And so we want to make sure all the safeguards are in place, including the due diligence piece of it, of course. I've participated and even led on some legislation related to China. China, I'm on the banking committee in China. Our own institutions like the SEC and the reporting requirements of publicly held companies is not the same for a foreign company as it is for American companies. And so I've been really aggressive about trying to get rules and regulations and laws in order that put not even the same requirements, but maybe more rigorous filing and disclosure requirements on Chinese-owned companies and foreign-owned companies than at least it should be as significant as American companies. So we can do a lot more, Rob, for sure. But I'm skeptical. Don't want to rob ourselves. It's hard when you're an agriculture producing state that obviously needs a lot more market than just what we consume in the United States. It's hard not to want to sell stuff to 1.4, 1.5 billion people in China. But it does, if you allow me to pivot for a second, it does raise the issue of how do we replace China as a market if in fact we cut them off totally.
That came up
right?
That came up in 2018 when you were running for the
Sure
Senate.
Did.
It came up with soybeans was kind of the primary. And I remember writing at the time, like, our policy about China has to be about more than soybean prices, because to me, that's I want our soybean growers to be as successful as they possibly can. I don't want to hurt them. But on the other hand, at what point can we not let our short-term economic interests trump our long-term, principles and moral, and not to mention our long-term security, because when you look at the amount China owns in like the agriculture sphere,
right,
it's a little frightening. I mean, if they just decided we're not doing it anymore, you talk about supply chain problems now, we'd be in a world of hurt.
No question. No, there's a lot to it. And you got your finger on that pulse for sure. But there are other big countries. I mean, India, speaking of the neighborhood, India has roughly the same population as China. Now they don't need a lot of soybeans, but they do eat a lot of things that we do grow in North Dakota and throughout the United States. But they're very protectionist. Now they're the world's largest democracy, and they have some sort of fun leadership, but they're not the same as us. If we're not learning anything about other democracies from Ukraine, we can learn it from India. Just because you're a democracy doesn't mean you're just like us. But they are a much friendlier nation, and they eat different things, but they do eat things like, particularly lentils and, peas, chickpeas, things that we can grow, and maybe we could grow more of if they'd be willing to buy them. The problem is they're very protectionist oriented. So a lot of work to do on this front. Geopolitics matters, but we can't be so focused on our individual needs or desires to ignore the larger picture for sure.
I mean, America needs to be the leader the world needs. I mean, even if sometimes they don't want to say they need us.
Boy, isn't that the truth?
They do. And gosh, look at Ukraine. Let's talk about that. You were just there.
Sure.
In fact, met with a North Dakotan who's kind of in some ways found himself in the middle with Russia rattling the saber, I guess is maybe the best way to put that. You have a North Dakota man who's there. He says he's in jail because of corruption. Obviously, the Ukrainian state says he tried to have somebody murdered. Tell us, what did you learn on your trip there?
Yeah, so it's interesting, specifically about Kurt Groshans, the Ashley, North Dakota farmer it's incarcerated. You've outlined the basics pretty well. Here's what I think. There's a lot of play here, but it appears to me from everything that I can see and that I have seen that we know to be true, never minding rumors, but what we know to be true. There's clearly a pattern that's concerning, and that pattern goes back to 2017, not that long after Kurt arrived there and got into the farming business and brought on a partner who now is the Minister of Agrarian and Food Issues, and some weird things, loss of money.
His partner would be something akin to like a cabinet
secretary of agriculture,
right? Cabinet secretary here in the United States, so high-ranking
right.
official.
And for those who've never been to Ukraine or maybe studied it, Ukraine is a lot like North Dakota. It's the breadbasket of Europe. Yeah. So for a farmer,
that's why everybody's always been fighting over it in Europe.
Precisely right, and that's why North Dakotans are drawn there. And there are a lot of North Dakotans that do business, agricultural business in Ukraine. They're also, in a lot of ways, they're like us. We have a lot of Ukrainian people in North Dakota. In fact, Kurt Groshans himself, his ancestry goes back to Ukraine. So it was a natural thing. But there were claims of embezzlement, lawsuits, a lot of obviously confrontation with this partner and a broken relationship that ultimately now leads to this scenario where Kurt's in jail. Now, the charges against Kurt, I'm not judging the veracity of those. I don't, it's interesting to me, but it's not important. Kurt is an American citizen.
Our interest is in making sure he gets a fair trial. It's
precisely right. And right now, I think the only way to assure that is to, frankly, bring him home. And so that's what I'm advocating with our State Department, with the Ukrainian government. I go back and forth every day between one or the other. I'm not negotiating it between them, but I'm encouraging both of them to that end.
How difficult is that in the context of Vladimir Putin lining his people up on the border looking for an excuse, and the Ukrainians are obviously pleading? I mean, they want us to help them. Right. They want us to back them. Let's talk about that for a minute. My daughter came to me and had been in history class, and her history teacher was talking about how we got into World War I and how we got into World War II, and everything starts with somebody crosses a border and that becomes a bit too much, and then allies start lining up saying we guaranteed that border and you shouldn't have crossed it, and that's how these conflagrations begin. And my thing to her was, we look through that lens and we see that those happened. We also ignore all the other times that somebody crossed the border they shouldn't have, and it didn't turn into a world war. So let's keep perspective. But this seems Russia hasn't been this belligerent in a long time,
right?
And this is scary.
It is scary, but your lesson to your daughter is really important, because, and this is what I hear a lot. And right now, as you know, there is a I'll call it a youth movement, even though they're not necessarily youth, but younger members of Congress, younger members in the media that don't see why the United States has any interest whatsoever in Ukraine, and why shouldn't Vladimir Putin have Ukraine after all? He's just protecting his one border. Well, if you put it through that lens of history, you know what Vladimir Putin's really after and why the Cold War was fought without firing a shot, but why our prevailing and splitting up the old Soviet Union into these individual states, what a difference that makes in terms of security to the world. And that preventing Vladimir Putin from coming into Ukraine is about much more than just him taking territory that once was his, or that that he feels entitled to. It is about the expanse of Vladimir Putin and communism and the destabilization of the West, particularly Europe, which has all these other ramifications. So rather than fighting a World War III, or worse, having Xi Jinping in China seeing our weakness in dealing with Vladimir Putin as a license for them to go take Taiwan,
right.
There's so many ramifications.
They're watching Ukraine and thinking Tibet. So that's
for sure Tibet. For at the very least, Taiwan. In which case, if they take Taiwan, that makes Japan vulnerable. And here's a natural outcome of that: is Japan can no longer rely on the United States nuclear umbrella, and they have to get nukes themselves. Indonesia, on and on it goes. So the stability of the world and the security of the United States is at stake on this one front in Ukraine.
Because you can't even imagine how quickly those conflagrations can hit our borders very, very fast. And I would argue that's the primary argument behind sort of America being involved in these places is we're going to be involved there before we end up being forced to be involved here in the homeland. Now, we've taken that to extremes in places and probably had some adventures that we could have done without. But
totally agree.
How do you square this with, because the Trump doctrine was America first, and he was very critical of our invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, which I don't know, maybe you could argue that some of the adventurism Iraq at least, some of the adventurism I was just talking about. But how do you square that with his sort of, which I think you very much have subscribed to, his sort of, America first, don't get involved. I don't want to call it isolationism because I think that's maybe more pejorative than it's
protectionism though.
Protectionism though, yeah. So how do you square that? Like how does because when you were talking about some younger members, I mean that's kind of a new idea that Trump ushered in, right? He brought that in. So how do you square that?
I don't know that he brought it in so much as he tapped in to it, or a combination. But he certainly gave voice to it.
That's fair,
for sure. And so giving voice to it makes it very popular. It's hard to square. It's hard to square on the one hand. On the other hand, so are lots of other complicated things. And balance is always important, and America's interests are always important. But America's interests aren't just America. Remember that we're 20% of the world's economy, but we're 5% of the world's population. That's an imbalance that we rather enjoy and appreciate. But that can only happen when the other 95% of the world is doing business with us. And so a certain America first, I do subscribe to, but America only, I do not subscribe to. And America first doesn't mean that you ignore the rest of the world, because if you do, pretty soon America's last. And so protecting America's interests in trade and commerce, even in security, it does require some involvement. It, at the very least, Rob, requires our leadership in places. This is why our leadership in Europe is so important, because Europe still largely looks to us. NATO is obviously created to prevent exactly what seems to be happening on the border with Ukraine. Even though Ukraine is not a NATO nation, that issue, of course, is what's at the forefront of Vladimir Putin's interests.
So let's talk about America's ability to be that leader in the world, because we've come through successive presidential administrations. George W. Bush, we had the adventure in Iraq, which I think we expended a lot of resources and things like that. We had 8 years of Barack Obama, who I don't think liked foreign policy that much. I don't think his foreign policy was often perfunctory and seemed like he was doing his homework before he got to do the things that he actually wanted to do. So I think he could often be conflicted and maybe a little confused. We had the Trump era, which I could probably say some things about Donald Trump's leadership that you wouldn't appreciate. But at the very least, maybe we can agree our country was so divided at that time, it was hard to have. That old concept of politics stops at the shore's edge wasn't it anymore. We had our own people were undermining. We were not united at all. And I don't think America can be the leader when we're not standing behind the president. And I'm not saying absolute loyal to the presidency, but you don't understand what I'm saying. Like, we're not divided. And now we have Joe Biden. How do we get back to being the leader? Because I think they do. I think a lot of these countries want America to step up. How do we be the country that they need us to be?
Yeah. So, you've drawn a pretty interesting picture. I would actually submit that while the country was divided under Donald Trump, the rest of the world at least respected us more, or at least feared maybe a little bit more than they do now. And because we make this massive switch over to President Biden, who has just demonstrated kind of incredible weakness on the world stage. I mean, just remarkable weakness. And I hear from these energy ministers, foreign ministers, from other countries that are very concerned about his expressions of weakness. Interestingly, just this last week, the foreign policy national security advisor to Chancellor Scholz of Germany called and wanted to come and see me, and he did. And we had a very good and important and quite frank discussion about Germany's sort of outlier position among the NATO allies and the European Union as it relates to Ukraine. And the reason he asked for a meeting with me was because I'd been somewhat critical and because I'd just come from Ukraine. And I just received an invitation to meet with the ambassador, or the European Union ambassador to the United States at his residence with the European Union energy, in whatever the position is, leader, minister, and to talk about some of these things, because I happen to feel pretty strongly about energy can be a uniting thing without using weapons. We can use energy development both in the United States and other places. But when you have this bizarre, weak, chaotic energy policy as well as national security policy from a president, there's nobody that knows what to believe or who to believe. Anyway, as you also know, I recently, maybe a couple months ago now, had a post or wrote an op-ed with General McMaster, H.R. McMaster, former Trump national security advisor, relating to a European U.S. carbon fee, border fee, not a domestic fee, very important distinction. And so I just think we need to reassert leadership in various institutions around the world in a way that doesn't, fire shots.
I agree with that. And I worry that we're so busy investigating one another and censuring one another and everything else that our ability, we got our skirts over our heads about domestic politics, that our ability to articulate and then execute a coherent national or foreign policy has been compromised. That worries me
along those lines, Rob, because I love this discussion. It's so timely, which is why you brought it up. Remember, we're having this rather remarkable debate about sanctions on Russia right now.
Right.
And what's remarkable about it is before I went to Ukraine, the U.S. Senate voted 55 to 45, 55 prevailing, which means it fails by 5 votes. Very abrupt and severe sanctions on the company building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Remembering that Donald Trump halted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a pipeline from Russia to Germany through underwater, the Black Sea and the Baltics, and we oppose that, and of course Germany wants it. Well, he halted it through sanctions, and then on this first day in office, Joe Biden gives it the green light, as a gift to Angela Merkel and Germany for some weird reason, and they finished it, and now it's all done except for certifying it and taking the natural gas. We passed sanctions, which, by the way, are overwhelmingly bipartisan. But we passed these sanctions, or failed to pass it on a 55 to 45 vote, because the president opposes it. And so several Democrats who otherwise would have supported it didn't, because the president supports it. There was a rival, and is a rival, package of sanctions led by Bob Menendez, a Democrat who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. His sanctions package does some of the same things, as well as a whole bunch of other things aimed at Russia, but aimed at things like access to banking. There's an international laws that govern, or regulations that govern the use of global markets, global access to money, internet, access, all of these things that we can shut off. Okay. But all of those sanctions would be put into effect incrementally after an invasion would take place rather than prior to an invasion. So you would think that would become enough of an incentive. Well, it hasn't been enough of an incentive. So what I advocated for, and I took a little heat for it right when we got back from Ukraine, but it has now gained a lot of momentum, is we've got to get all the sides together, come up with a sanctions package that is strong enough for Republicans to vote for, but also incremental enough for Democrats to vote for, that has enough oomph to it that the European Union can get behind, so that Vladimir Putin feels the heat, and it deters. I had this position with the president, this really an argument with the president himself when I got back from Ukraine. I say all that because at the end of the day, Rob, to your point, my view has been, it's not just about the sanctions. It's about the unity that backs up the sanctions. That's what matters. If we gravitate to the lowest common denominator that gets 55 senators okay and 5 reluctantly, we pass sanctions. But what we don't have is the message that comes with those sanctions that says, no, damn it, the United States of America and the European Union and all of us are on board with this, and that will have, I think, the kind of muscle that could deter Vladimir Putin, and has the additional value that you're talking about of a unified voice. We need to get there somehow.
Let's spend our last few minutes talking about domestic energy. I was just reading an article in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and it was about Minnesotans who are turning down their thermostats and huddling under blankets because of price increases. And I wrote a column saying this was the most predictable damn thing in the world. You moved us to natural gas, and all due respect to our natural gas producers, who are wonderful people making a great product. Gas is a volatile market, and we have by shifting away from coal energy because renewables can't carry the load, we have dramatically increased demand for supply that can be fickle, and shockingly, the result is price hikes and in some extreme instances shortages. So are we coming to a reckoning? Because it seems like for so long we had this sort of political favoritism where, and I feel like, again, it plays out in a microcosm right here in North Dakota. We went from Coal Creek Station was going to be closed and replaced by wind power to actually Coal Creek Station is going to continue to operate, and they're going to continue to buy coal-fired electricity from it for like another 2 decades. That seemed to me like a tacit acknowledgement that reality has to win at some point here. Is that, I feel like that's starting, I very much feel a shift too that's happening. I saw one of your, in fact, I used a quote from you as a headline on a recent appearance. I think it was Fox Business, but it was saying something like, we can't destroy ourselves to try to save the future, right? And I thought that was so great, because I see a shift where before it was close down the coal plants and everything else too. Actually, let's maybe find ways we can continue to use coal through carbon capture, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like there's a big shift here. Maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, but I feel like it's coming. Like at some point, it's just we're running into the brick wall of reality, and we got to do something.
So the quote you're referencing was from an NPR interview.
Oh, NPR. Even more boy, I got that way wrong. Fox. That's right. It was NPR.
Yeah, I actually was.
I should have known from the NPR voice in the interview. Right? I should remember that.
Right on. Right.
They all talk the same way. Like very.
They all.
Now
talk
we
the same
have
way.
Senator Kevin Cramer on.
It's a different format than this. However, it was a similar format in that it was a long interview that was boiled down to 7 minutes. And then, as you know, in radio, 7 minutes is a long time. And that's the gift of NPR, I guess we'll put it that way. And so it's the reality that you talk about. Is there a shift taking place? There's nothing in the world that will create a reality check like inflation. The problem with the inflation and the energy side is two things. One is energy inflation adds to the cost of everything. So even when there's other inflation taking place.
Like it's not just your gas bill, it's the grocery store's gas bill as well.
Yeah, exactly. And everything that it uses. And even the manufacturing of products with natural gas, all that said. At the same time that we have domestic policy that has curtailed the production of the very thing that is, growing in demand. And this relates, not so ironically, back to Ukraine again. So getting back to the domestic piece of it, this reality is coming home to roost. But you take a state like Minnesota, and they're the customer of, our biggest customer for North Dakota generated electricity, whether that electricity is generated by coal, wind, or natural gas or something else. They don't want coal. And remember, there was a fight decades ago that we prevailed on, the externalities law, and I won't get into all those things. But suddenly, there was enough of a political movement in Minnesota that they said, we don't want your coal, but we'll take other stuff until they learned this lesson that I learned when I was, of course, a public service commissioner, although I knew it before as well. Coal contracts are like 20, 30, and I think in some cases as much as 40 years old. So you contract the price of coal decades into the future.
I think like the Coal Creek stations, like they have a contract with North American Coal or whatever their local entity is.
Falkirk Mine.
Yeah, Falkirk Mine, where my brother-in-law works, as it happens. But they have their contract was like a 100-year contract, I think.
Yeah.
Or maybe I misunderstood that, but it was a really long time.
It's really long time. And so then but you replace that with another fossil fuel, albeit one that burns about 50% cleaner. So you can clear your conscience a little bit if that concerns you. And then accept that it's subject to global markets. It's priced on the global market. There's no contract for it. It is whatever the price is that particular day. You might get a little bit of a contract. You might get some sort of, but there's always a pass-through cost because it's a market-driven volatile price. So they're learning that lesson the hard way. The Biden administration hopefully is learning some of these same lessons. And there was an article a couple of days ago on this same topic where I was quoted as saying, hopefully they're learning their lesson, even if it's late. And because there is some evidence that they're sort of learning the lesson. But here's the biggest problem. Everybody wants, I say everybody, I shouldn't say it like that. The radicals want to transfer or export their climate guilt. And that's the other problem that exists. Vladimir Putin's natural gas, just as an example, produced, compressed, sent through a pipeline to other parts of Europe through the life cycle, emits 41% more greenhouse gases than American natural gas liquefied, put on a ship, and sent to the same destination. So, but John Kerry runs around, Asia and Europe saying, "Don't buy American gas. Don't buy American gas."
Yeah, there's another way to look at it too. You run up the price of power in the United States. That drives manufacturing out of the country. Where does it go?
That's right.
Someplace like China. That's right. Where's China getting its electricity from? Coal. So instead of using coal in the United States, where we can regulate it and do all sorts of stuff like get research and development grants and try carbon capture and try to address the real problem of emissions, because that is a real problem we're solving.
Sure.
Instead of trying to do it here, we just export the problem to China, where they don't care. And they're just going to do whatever is good for the Chinese Communist Party's bottom line. So talking about exporting the problem. Anyway, we're out of time. We did an hour,
Imagine that.
So I appreciate it. And that's honestly, you talk about the NPR thing. I love interviewing you on the podcast so much more than all the interviews we did on radio. No offense to the talk radio guys, but boy, I like being able to talk with you without having to worry about a commercial break bearing down on us or something like that. Although I miss the callers, but oh well. Anyway, thanks for your time, Kevin. Appreciate it. And
no,
Stay warm out there.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. I will stay warm. It's going to warm up naturally, thank goodness.
It always does,
around
inevitably.
Here,
just
right?
like there's
It
always,
does.
just like
Isn't it
there's
funny?
always another election. Eventually, February's always over.
That's right.
March
And
is
by the
coming.
way, I think you represent the callers just fine. So
Do
I like the format as well.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Kevin, thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rob.